Okay, here we are back from our break, and we spent the last time talking about the growth of Germanic Europe. Now we're going to turn to the East and look at Islam and the return of the Middle East and the growth of a culture in the East, the third heir of Rome that we haven't looked at yet. We looked at the Germans, and let me add just a little bit about the Germans as we move into the Islamic area. Islam and Germanic Europe are growing at the very same time, and they're growing at the very same time that the Byzantine Empire was. They're the three heirs of Rome, and they're exactly simultaneous. Okay, so we have to go back and look at each one individually. I might mention women. Here are some Merovingian women at this time, and scholars of women's history look at Germanic women as very free and equal, that they're very powerful women in both the Merovingian Empire and the Carolingian Empire. We see a great age of the freedom and the power of women, and so here are some more of these women who have a lot of influence in society. There's actually one Merovingian queen who is the power behind the throne of two of her sons and three of her grandsons, and she was just extremely powerful. She killed a lot of people and wielded power like any man would. And so the women are very powerful at this time. And here's some very beautiful pictures. We saw the Carolingian Renaissance and the growth, the explosion of culture during the time of Charlemagne, and the Carolingian Renaissance became the basis of the growth of European culture. And we mentioned the parenthesis: without Islam there would be no Charlemagne, and it's certainly true that the Carolingian Renaissance is the foundation of the culture of Europe as it grows, and so we've seen the creation of that. And here are some more of the some of the typical artwork from the Carolingian Empire. These are ivories that are done in Carolingian time. Okay, the three heirs of Rome. Now we're going to deal with the third heir, and this is Islam. In this particular map, Islam is shown in the green area on this map. Okay, and we talked about a lot of renaissances that happened in the Germanic states and in the Carolingian Empire. Now we're going to talk about a Middle Eastern Renaissance, a revival of the Middle Eastern culture in a new form. And we remember our Mesopotamian culture with the ziggurats. And again, we remember the environment, the geography of that area. And this is Mesopotamia, but Arabia looks pretty much like this too. And here we see a vast desert, and this is the region that we're going to talk about in the Middle East, where we have a lot of vast deserts. Okay, here is the Roman Empire, and Arabia, as you can see on that map, is not a part of the Roman Empire. The Holy Land is, but Arabia is not. And when we talked about the origins of Christianity, we mentioned that Jesus appeared in a backwater, in a corner of the empire that nobody cared about and nobody was paying any attention to. And Islam arose in the same kind of an environment, in a backwater like Palestine, in a place that nobody cared about and nobody was paying attention to. It was on the fringes, way outside the center of civilization. And often as we look at these various cultures, we will find that something new, anything new that's happening, that's growing, is usually on the edges of the culture. It's not in the middle, it's out on the edges where brand new innovations are happening. And this is the case with Arabia as well. And here we see this map. We have to recall also that Justinian, remember the empire of Justinian when he tried to reconquer the Roman Empire, and here we can see Justinian's conquests in yellow. And at that very time, Persia was revived. The Persian kingdom on that map was revived, and we have a great war between Justinian's general Belisarius and the Persian Empire. And remember that they exhausted each other in a great war, so that at the very moment when Islam arose, the two greatest powers in that region were the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire, and they had just slaughtered each other. They had exhausted each other completely in a great war. So this is the environment that Islam arose, and here they arose on the Arabian Peninsula, and here we can see it on our Eastern Hemisphere map, and here we see a close-up of the Arabian Peninsula. Arabia was a backwater, and it's a great desert, and caravan routes stretched across it, camels going across the desert, going from the two major cities, Mecca and Medina. Okay, Mecca and Medina were ruled by merchant princes, and they were city cultures, ruled in a city government. But elsewhere in Arabia, there was tribal organization. And all over Arabia, there were Bedouin tribes that practiced a primitive animistic religion centered around the Kaaba. And the Kaaba was a black meteorite that had landed somewhere in there, and according to legend, it was the stone on which Abraham had attempted to sacrifice Isaac, but it has its origins much earlier than that in the animistic religions of the Bedouins. There were Christians and Jews also in Arabia. There were Coptics and Nestorian Christians in Yemen, and there were a lot of Jews there. And so Arabia was a place where a lot of different kinds of religions were all mixing together. It was in this environment that Muhammad appeared, and here we can see these Arabic nomads and Bedouins and camel herders ranging across the desert of Arabia with this tribal society. And the Arab merchant city dweller, here's an Arab merchant city dweller, side by side with the Bedouins were sophisticated city dwellers and merchants who profited from the caravan trade. Muhammad appeared in this environment and lived from 571 to 632 in the city of Mecca. Okay, let me see. Okay, this is the city of Mecca. I wanted to show you the city of Mecca. We'll come back to the city of Mecca because it's the holiest city of Islam, but here is the city as it was later. Muhammad lived from 571 to 632. In our lecture we just had, what was going on in Europe at that time? Was just as Gregory's, okay, what else is going on? I've got it already written down. Just as Gregory's missionaries were setting out for England. This is also the time when St. Benedict was writing the Benedictine rule, and Gregory the Great was Pope, just as he was sending his missionaries out for England and turning European culture toward the north. Okay. In 610, Muhammad had visions, and these were visions that were written down as the Quran, okay? He wrote these visions down, and the terms that come out of the writing of the Quran is a sacred book that is an uncreated book that has existed forever. It was uncreated, so it has always been in existence. Muhammad's visions that were written down were the Quran. The Ummah were the people of Allah, and Islam is the name of the religion, and the word Islam means surrender. We call the believers in Islam Muslims. It is not correct to call them Mohammedans, as we call Christians, because that would imply that people worship Muhammad, and he is not a god. He is a prophet. He is a bringer of the wisdom to the Muslims or believers. when Muhammad started preaching around Mecca, people didn't listen to him. There were rebellions, and he had to actually flee from Mecca and go to the city of Medina in 622. And this is called the Hijrah. And 622 is the date of the beginning of the Muslim calendar, which commemorates his flight from Mecca to Medina. We might also mention that he was a merchant, and he was a young merchant who worked for more prosperous merchants. He ended up making his fortune by marrying a woman who was older than he was, and making his fortune in that way. He also had several other wives. He had more than one wife, and the youngest was supposed to have been his favorite wife. So the Hijrah happens in 622, and he goes to Medina. When he got to Medina, he started preaching the Quran, the wisdom that he had obtained, supposedly dictated to him by the angel Gabriel. And he acquired a lot of followers and a lot of believers in Medina. He ended up taking over the whole city of Medina and taking his followers and then conquering Mecca. So by 630, he had conquered Mecca, and immediately he rallied a whole force behind him, and by 632, all Arabia was conquered. The slogan that was preached was, "There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet." The Muslim religion, and here we have, this is a picture of an Arab rushing around conquering everything. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. Islam combines a lot of the elements of the Jewish religion and the Old Testament prophets, plus Jesus, who's regarded as a prophet, and it's a kind of combination of all of those different elements blended together in a very distinctively Arabic way. The Arabs were very good at poetry, and the Quran itself is very poetic. It reads like a great poem. The Quran was the word of God dictated by the angel Gabriel, an original uncreated book in heaven, and this means that every letter is sacred. Okay, if every letter is sacred, what does that mean? If the Quran is dictated by the angel Gabriel and every single letter is sacred, what does that mean? Yes?
Can't be translated or changed at all.
Excellent. You cannot translate it and you cannot change it. The Quran is organized in a very interesting way. If I can recall correctly, it's either that the longest book is first and it works down to the shortest. I think that's how it is, or it's the shortest first and it works to the longest, but I'm pretty sure it's the longest first, yeah. And so it's not organized according to subjects. Again, I said it's very poetic, and so it's this poetic wisdom according to how long each of the books is. It's the supreme law in religion and law and science and the humanities. The Quran is the central book to everything. It's supreme in every element of the society. Okay. Here's a passage from the Quran. Every letter is sacred, and this means that translation is a heresy. And it's also forbidden to make any graven images. Remember, the Old Testament says, "Thou shalt make no graven images." And it's taken in the Quran in a very extreme way, that no images of God or Muhammad or human beings are to be made at all. So what does this mean to their art? If you cannot make any images, and this includes animals, you can't make images of living things. So what is this going to mean? What is their art going to be like? What's left? Well, part of their art is the script, the sacred letters of the Koran, and so a lot of the art is simply quotations from the Koran that are put on buildings or on manuscripts, and so this becomes part of the art. Then you're going to have mostly decorative things. You're going to have geometrical patterns. You're going to have squares and circles and triangles and zigzag lines and so on, and all geometric lines, and that's the kind of art we're going to say. There are 5 precepts of the faith, and these are often represented by the 5 fingers of your hand. Okay, and so here they are. What is this a sign of if you use your hand and your 5 fingers as the symbol of the sacred precepts of the faith? What does this suggest to you if you're using your hand as a symbol? It's a mnemonic device. This means it's a pre-literate society. They're not literate. And remember, we talked about the 10 Commandments. You use your 10 fingers to remember them. This is a pre-literate society. And here are the 5 precepts of faith. There's no God but Allah. And they are to live sober and upright lives, pray towards Mecca 5 times a day. Ramadan is ritual fasting that takes place for 1 month a year. Pilgrimage to Mecca takes place once in a lifetime, and charity is giving alms to the poor. Okay. People are to live sober, upright, and solemn lives. Praying towards Mecca is done in the direction of Mecca. Is very interesting when you're in Muslim, or when I won't say all Muslim countries, but when I was in Malaysia and I would travel around and go to hotel rooms, there was always an arrow on the ceiling that pointed to the direction of Mecca, so you would always know what direction to pray in. The praying 5 times a day takes place at sunup and at meal times during the day and at sundown, and the call to prayer is very public. Islam is a very communal religion that emphasizes the unity of the community, and so the praying toward Mecca is usually done in a group. You go to a mosque or you go to a room and everybody prays together as a group. They're called to prayer from the towers around the mosque, and often the call to prayer is done with a loudspeaker, and it's done with a very loud chant. And so this is fine in Muslim countries. There are a lot of Muslims who live around Detroit and Michigan, and the neighbors often complain when the sun comes up and the call to prayer goes out over the whole city. But this is done in a very communal way. Men and women are separated. They do not pray together. And when you go into a mosque, the men are usually in the main floor, and they would pray in the center of the church. Women are put behind a screen and usually up on a balcony where they're out of the sight of the men. Ramadan is ritual fasting for an entire month of a year, and obviously they don't refrain from eating or drinking for the entire month because you'd starve to death, but it's fasting from sunup to sundown, and so that a meal is taken before the sun arises. The family might have a meal together, and then all day long they refrain from eating and drinking and smoking, and some people don't even swallow their saliva. They take it so seriously that they're not to have any nourishment whatsoever. And then when the sun goes down, after sundown, they might have a large family meal and a celebration with special ritual foods, the same way that we might at a Thanksgiving dinner or something of that type. And it's a time of celebration. It's done as a religious ritual, so that the believers who well, everybody takes part in it, but the believers will have the experience of what it's like to be poor and to be hungry. It's a way to make them attuned to the suffering of those less fortunate. And so it's, again, ritual fasting 1 month a year. It's the holiest month of the year, and it's ended with a great celebration after Ramadan is over. It's a feast that moves around in the year. It's a movable feast that happens at a different time every year because Islam operates on a lunar calendar, and so this is not the same as a solar calendar, so that Ramadan happens, I think, a little bit earlier each year, and so it can be at any time of year, usually a little bit earlier than the year before, so at different times every year. And it's not done in a modern way according to the calendar, but in many Muslim countries, Ramadan is only declared by the wise men of the town or the village where they're in, and the wise men, the oldest men, sit and they observe the rising of the moon every night, and when the moon reaches the exact right phase, then they announce it to the whole village or the whole town. Ramadan starts tomorrow, and it happens in different places. Ramadan might start in one country at a different time than another, depending on what the wise men of the town observe and when they announce that it's going to start. And they do the same thing when they announce it's going to end. And obviously it depends on where you live as to how you're affected by Ramadan. If you live on the equator, when days and nights are equal, Ramadan will be the same no matter what time of year it's in. But if you're a Muslim and you live in Sweden and Ramadan happens in the middle of the summer, when the sun never sets, you're in big trouble. And there are a lot of Muslims in Sweden, by the way, and Norway, which is kind of interesting. The pilgrimage to Mecca, you're not required, but it's hoped that you will make a pilgrimage to Mecca once in your lifetime. And once you go to Mecca, you travel there, and it's a very great celebration to go. The pilgrims who go wear white clothing to signify that they're going on pilgrimage, and once they get to Mecca, they then go through a lot of rituals of marching around the city and going to sacred places in the city. They are issued and you're supposed to, in the middle of the pilgrimage, there's a post that represents the devil, and you're supposed to throw rocks at the devil, march around the Kaaba 3 times, and once you have completed your pilgrimage to Mecca, you're given a certificate to commemorate it, and you're entitled to wear a special hat that's a sign that you have actually been to Mecca. But if you're too poor to go to Mecca, you're excused from making that pilgrimage. But anybody who has the means to do it is very much encouraged to do it. Charity or alms to the poor is obvious, and this is a great requirement and there are a large number of charities within Islam that people give to because of this requirement. So those are the 5 precepts of Islam. There are a number of different elements that we might talk about that are also part of Islam. Jihad is one of a well-known part of it, and the concept of jihad has changed rather drastically over the centuries. When it was first formulated, jihad was thought of as an internal struggle, a struggle with yourself to overcome the obstacles to being devout. Now it has changed over time, and it's largely because of the Crusades, the European Crusades in Europe, that changed the concept of jihad to more of a holy war. It always had that connotation of a holy war, but it became a more overt holy war, very much more emphasized at the time of the Crusades of Europe, of going to the Holy Land. So jihad is the supremely meritorious activity. Service to the church and service to the state are identical, and in Islam, the church is the state. Everybody is under one ruler, the caliph, who is head of both church and the state, and religion is the law. The Quran is the law. There's another element of law, another code of law called the Sharia, which is an elaboration of the Quranic law. That the Sharia is applied to the daily life, and it's the often it's the law of Islam. Okay. Here is Mecca and the city of Mecca. The Kaaba has been incorporated into Islam, and the Kaaba is this building in the center of the city that you can see that is black. Here that's actually a black covering that's put over the Kaaba, but it's a building that encases the sacred meteorite that was part of the earlier ancient religion, interpreted in Islam as a meteorite stone on which Abraham agreed to sacrifice Isaac. And pilgrims who go to Mecca march around the Kaaba 3 times, and so you can see the city here. Here's the Kaaba, a close-up of the Kaaba with the pilgrims coming and marching around it. You can see it's covered with a kind of cloth. And so this is the best time of year to go on pilgrimage is during Ramadan. And so huge numbers of pilgrims go to Mecca during Ramadan. And often there are very tragic riots that are there when people try to cross bridges. There are too many people and they collapse, and there are always stories of that happening. But you can see in this drawing that there are huge crowds that all go to Mecca at the same time. Islam is a synthesis of Jewish, Christian, and Persian ideas. It adopts Jewish and Christian prophets. And in the original Islam, and hopefully Islam today, people of the book are tolerated, and people of the book are interpreted as Jews and Christians, who are thought of as people to whom God revealed elements of Islam before its completion with the revelations to Muhammad. And so Judaism and Christianity are looked at by Muslims as precursors to Islam, and Islam is seen as a more mature and complete revelation. They also incorporate elements of Zoroastrianism with the concepts of heaven and hell, and right living according to a code of proper behavior. And this reminds us of Zoroastrianism, which is the old Persian religion incorporated into Islam. It has an element of Persian autocracy with the rule of the caliph, who rules both church and state in a very autocratic way. Interestingly, the position of women was elevated by Muhammad. He is looked on as freeing women from slavery and liberating them in a very great way. Although polygamy is still practiced, and these are probably Persian practices that were incorporated by Islam, but polygamy is still practiced. Muslims are allowed to have 4 wives. Muslim men are allowed to have 4 wives. Muslim women are not allowed to have multiple husbands. And the men are only allowed 4 wives if they can afford them. And so the rule is you have as many wives, up to 4, as you can afford, and a man is supposed to support each of these wives in an adequate sort of way, so that if he's very poor, he has to make do with 1 wife, and the wealthier he is, the more wives he can have, up to 4. The wives, and I'm familiar with the practices in Malaysia. It's quite interesting that the developments that I saw and that I came in contact with were that men would marry at different stages in their career, so that when they were first starting out their career, they would marry a young woman who was usually their equal, who would contribute to the family enterprise to make the man as wealthy as he could aspire to be, and to further his career. And then as he reached a certain stage in his career, he might marry again a woman who would be wealthier and who would further his career even more. And this he would do up to 4 times as he would become wealthier. And hopefully he would be wealthy enough to situate each family in its own separate home. And they wouldn't necessarily have contact with the families together. This is how it worked in Malaysia, and I'm not sure how other countries work, but it was a very interesting concept. Divorce is possible, and divorce can be attained by either men or women, and all they have to declare is, I divorce you 3 times. They state, I divorce you 3 times, and they're able to have a divorce. Women are also entitled to property in the marriage if they have a divorce. And these are the elements that elevated women at the time that Muhammad preached. As time has gone on, we see in different Muslim countries that we often think of the women as being oppressed, being separated from men, being secluded in their houses and denied the same rights that men have. Often, when I've talked to Muslims, they will say that this segregation of women and limitation of women is often the consequence of pre-Muslim societies. For example, among the Bedouins, women were very much oppressed, and so often the oppression of women, Muslims attribute to local cultures as a local kind of thing and not necessarily part of Islam. There actually is a women's movement in Islam that I came in contact with in Malaysia. If you go through the Quran, you can see there are key texts that elevate the position of women. One that comes to mind right now is, if you do a kindness to a woman, you do a good thing. And there's a whole collection of texts from the Quran that praise and elevate and honor women, and there is a women's movement that emphasizes these and works for women's rights within Islam. The paradise in Islam, we mentioned a heaven and a hell. Paradise, interestingly, is very characteristically Arabian. It's an oasis or a garden, and so the garden is thought of as the Garden of Eden with the 4 rivers of paradise flowing together. And often these are seen in Persian rugs. Here's the promenade of the harem. A harem is a place where women are secluded, where there are multiple wives secluded in the harem. And here is a garden in a Persian rug. So if you look at a lot of Persian rugs that are done according to the principles of Islam, we have geometric kinds of art and symbols. We don't have any representation of human beings, but we might have plants and flowers. And so this is the great garden. The Persian rug would represent paradise. So that's interesting to know if you have Persian rugs. Islam was a militant religion, and remember that the entire Middle East was prostrated by the violent wars between the Byzantine Empire and the Persians, and so when Muhammad and his army burst forth, they conquered very quickly the entire Mediterranean and Middle Eastern region. By 630, the early conquest lasted from 632 to 655 over the prostrated area. In 636, Damascus and Jerusalem fell. In 640, Syria was occupied. 637 to 647, they went to the east, and Persia was conquered, so they're spreading both east and west. In the 640s, Egypt fell. In 655, they entered the Mediterranean, and Cyprus was controlled. And after this great bursting forth of great conquest to both east and west, then they stopped for a while. 655, we have a period of civil war that lasted from 655 to 661. And the Islamic world divided up into the Umayyad and the Fatimid factions, which are today the Sunnis and the Shiites. And here let's look at a couple of pictures. Here's the entrance of Omar the Great into Jerusalem, and as the Muslims conquered, they prided themselves in conquering by diplomacy and peace rather than violent conquest. For example, in Jerusalem, the city was surrendered without a battle, and Omar the Great entered Jerusalem and took it over. In Egypt, in the Byzantine Empire, there were a lot of quarrels going on within the church, a lot of disagreements, and Egypt fell rather easily and quickly because people were dissatisfied with some of the theological decisions that the church had proclaimed in Egypt. Okay, here is the Mosque of Omar in Jerusalem, which is also called the Dome of the Rock and is still being fought over in Jerusalem. This is a great sacred church. It's built mosque that's built on the site of a church that was built on the site of a Jewish sacred spot, and so this particular spot is sacred to Jews, Christians, and Muslims. So it's a site they all want. And still struggling over it. From 655 to 661, we have a period of civil wars, and the Muslims were divided into the Umayyad and Fatimid factions, which are today the Sunnis and the Shia. The Fatimids argued that the Caliph must be the descendant of Muhammad. And at that time, Fatima, he had a surviving daughter, Fatima, and her husband claimed the throne. The Umayyads fought against that and declared, rather, that any holy person chosen by God could rule. As it ended up, the Umayyads were dominant everywhere but Egypt, and they took over the whole empire except for Egypt, which was ruled by the Fatimids. And at this time, when the civil wars were going on, the capital was moved to Damascus, and the Umayyads dynasty, the Umayyads ruled from 661 to 750 AD, of course. Okay, and here is Damascus, where the capital was moved to Damascus, from Mecca to Damascus, because it's a more central region, closer to Persia, which is really important. Here are the tombs of the caliphs in Damascus. They were ruling from Damascus. And here we see the extent of the Muslim empire at its fullest extent. It actually is bigger than that, but at this time it's its fullest extent. Now, under the Umayyad dynasty, there were attacks on Constantinople from 750 to 680, and they were stopped by the secret weapon of the Byzantines, which was Greek fire. In 717 and 718, we have the last Arab attack on Constantinople because they more or less stopped attacking the Byzantines and gave up. But in 711, Visigothic Spain was conquered, and it became one of the richest provinces of the whole empire. In the 730s, southern Gaul was invaded, and as we noticed last time, it was stopped by Charles Martel in 732 at the Battle of Tours. And I suggested to you that it's not really true that Charles Martel saved Europe from the onslaught of Islam. If you were a Muslim and you had a choice between the poverty-stricken, empty, backward lands of Gaul or France and the Persian Empire, which one would you choose? they couldn't spread themselves thin forever, and so I think the Muslims chose Persia. They would have, if they had wanted to conquer Europe and Gaul, they would have done it. They could have, and so nothing really stopped them. Okay, so here is the extent of the Muslim Empire. This is a naval battle showing the use of Greek fire, and the Greeks are fighting off the Muslims in this battle. Okay. Here's in this map, you can see Mecca and Medina in Arabia. I've circled in red, and then the capital is moved to Damascus, which is in more of the central region of the lands they conquer. You can see Damascus there to the north. Arabic was a universal language, and within one generation, the leaders of the Muslim Empire were Persians. Okay, the Arabs ruled over the rest of them only for one generation, and Persian learning and knowledge and expertise rose to the top of the social pyramid very quickly. And one reason this happens is because under Islam, all believers are equal before God, and so it doesn't matter where you're from in the entire Islamic empire. If you're a Muslim, everybody is equal, and there's complete social mobility. You can rise to the top. So no matter what ethnic identity you are, you can rise to the top in Islam. The Greek and Roman and Persian classics were blended together, and a very high culture developed very quickly. Islam was transformed to Syriac, from Arab to Syriac and Persian. It's an empire like the Roman Empire. It was eclectic, and there was a synthesis of all of these different cultures. Islam was ruled as a Pax Islamica, and the trade routes, and especially Islam, is a very mercantile society. Merchants are the key element in Islam, and they developed all kinds of institutions that that helped the flow of trade from one end of the empire to the other. And the banking institutions that later were transferred to Europe were actually developed first by Islam, so that you could write a check in Spain and you could cash it in Damascus. And there were holding companies and trading companies developed so that you could go from one end of the empire to another and still have your business connections from one end to another. Remember that we said that you can't translate the Quran, so what this means is that Arabic becomes the universal language, and everybody spoke Arabic. It's the lingua franca, you might say, of the Islamic Empire, just as Latin was the key language in the Roman Empire, and Chinese became the key language in the Han Empire. Arabic tied it all together. We can speak of a Pax Islamica, the culture of the Pax Islamica, which preserved Greek and Roman and Persian classics, and the pattern is very much the same as in the Roman Empire. Remember, in the Roman Empire we had a veneer of Latin and Greek culture that spread over all the conquered people, and the same is true in the Islamic Empire. There's a veneer of Arabic culture that spreads over everyone. But because of the equality of believers, the native cultures rise to predominate. It's an eclectic culture, and it's synthetic. There's a synthesis of all these different elements: Greek, Roman, Syriac, and Persian elements. And we have a great flowering of science, largely because of the background of Greek and Persian and Babylonian, Mesopotamian science. We now have science blossoming throughout the Arabic world. Algebra, they excel in astronomy. Algebra, in fact, is an Arabic world. They invented algebra. Greek medicine was preserved and improved upon, and there's a flowering of art that combines Persian, Roman, Greek, and Arabic elements. Islam itself was transformed from Arabic to Syriac to Persians. Trade is the basis of the empire. Trade is a merchant society. Trade is the most important. And one of the main characteristics of the Islamic empire is slavery. Slavery was extremely predominant, and it was a fundamental part of the whole Islamic society. And this is true to this day. If you look at Arabic culture in Arabia and in Lebanon, in the various states of the Persian and Arabic world, slavery still is practiced, and once in a while we'll find an article in the newspaper today of slavery being practiced in America and being discovered because slavery is still, there are remnants of it that are still there. Here's the Alhambra. I'm going to show you some of the art and architecture. The Alhambra is in Spain. It's one of the masterpieces of Islamic art. See the building here? Here's the inside. It is absolutely glorious, beautiful art. We might notice some of the elements that we've seen before. We have slender and elegant Greek columns. We have Roman arches now extended in a more elaborate horseshoe kind of arch. The walls are covered with Roman mosaics, which now attain a great brilliance, and then we see Persian lace-like domes and arches above the windows. You can see that sort of lace-like decorations. Notice the arch in the very front is an elongated pointed arch, which is very typical of Islam. And so you can see these Roman elements and these Persian elements and Greek elements all blending together in a richer new culture. We might look at the fountain in the middle, again, the waters of paradise. And so we see the elements of Islam translated into the architecture. This is the center of a mosque, and again, paradise is a garden. One of the things we see with these columns are symbolic palm trees, so that in the center of the mosque, with all the columns and the tops to the columns, the capitals, are symbolic palm trees, so that you're in a garden when you're in the mosque, representing paradise. Again, and here is the Alhambra. Again, these are some of the gardens and the corridors of the Alhambra, and you can see this elaborate Muslim art, this very gorgeous art. This is a building that still exists today. This is a drawing, of course. Note the elaborate geometric design, the horseshoe arches, geometric design. Again, we have to remember that there's not supposed to be any human representations. And Arabic poetry still practiced a predominance, and we see a poet with a guitar player at the forefront. Okay, here is some of this geometric design that we see on all of the mosques that we're looking at. We see geometric design at the top, and at the bottom you see geometric design combined with floral design with sayings from the Quran script that are written into it. And so this is very typically Muslim. Here is the court of the Mosque of Tulun in Cairo, and we see many of those same elements that we saw in the Alhambra, but somewhat different. They don't slavishly copy, but we see the same styles. Notice the coffered roof, which is very much like the Roman kind of ceiling that you might see in a Roman church, and this is adopted in this church. And here is the Mosque of Muhammad Ali. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting where that is. I think it's in Egypt. But this is a typical mosque with a slender graceful minarets at each corner of the mosque where the call to prayer would be done. The Roman dome is adopted. All of those domes were, the domes were originally invented by the Romans, and so they're incorporated into this style of architecture. And here is a Moorish doorway in Cordoba on the right, where you can see again the elaboration and of the arch into even a more circular form, geometric elements on a door on the left. And here is yet another mosque. I think this one is in India, and so that the Muslims then spread farther to the east, conquered India, spread all the way across India, and all the way to, by the 14th century, they were in Indonesia and Malaysia, all the way to Asia. And this is Indian. I'm pretty sure this building is Indian, and now combining elements of Indian culture. A traveling dervish of Khorasan is part of the mixture of Indian culture, which is now mixed into this rich mixture of all the different cultures. The Abbasid dynasty ruled from 762 to 1055, and at this point the capital of the Muslim empire was shifted even farther eastward to Persia in Baghdad. And again, the empire was becoming even more Persianized. There was a Eurasian-wide commercial network from Scandinavia to Malaysia and Indonesia, from Spain to Africa and India. The very height of Islamic culture was under Harun al-Rashid from 786, who ruled from the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. And somewhat after that time, the title of the ruler was changed from Caliph to Sultan in 950. At around this time, we see a great cultural flowering and renaissance in Spain. And Avicenna and Averroes are the two most prominent scholars who are practicing in Spain. Avicenna was a Renaissance man who was a great figure in literature and science, and as a diplomat. He was a man who was skilled in all fields, lived from 980 to 1037, and he's thought of as the height of culture in Spain at that time. Under the Muslims in Spain, there was a great flowering of Jewish culture, and the Jews flowered, and this is the time when great Jewish philosophers like Maimonides were writing in Spain, and we see a rich blending of those cultures together, which we wish could still go on today, with the toleration and the sharing between between the Muslim and the Jewish and the Christian culture in Spain. It was a model of tolerance and sharing and cooperation. And here we see the shift of the capital, and Damascus is in red, Baghdad is in purple, again shifting ever eastward. Persia becomes really the center of the Muslim empire at this time. Okay. In 1055, we see, though, an invasion of the Muslim empire, and these are some pagan, I guess you would call them, non-Muslim Seljuk Turks who come charging into the Muslim region. They're quickly converted to Islam. They're Turkic nomads from the plains of Central Asia. They're the same people invading the Chinese empire at that very time. Turkic nomads. They convert to Islam. What they do is shatter the unity of the Islamic world, just as they shattered the unity of the Chinese world, and at other times we had seen them already invading Europe as well. The Grand Sultan is now a Turk, and he rules a confederacy rather than a unified empire. And the Turks who come into this region have the zeal of new converts. The Battle of Manzikert in 1071 was a battle between the Seljuk Turks and the Byzantines were defeated. And at this time, they're terrified that the Turks are going to conquer the Byzantine Empire. So the Byzantines then appeal to the West. They appeal to the Pope. And here we see the great Seljuk Empire. Moving into that empire, we have nomads in Arabia, and we have the red areas, the Seljuk Empire. The Fatimids are the green area to the south. The green area to the north are Danishmedes, who are Muslims, and the pink area are the Seljuks of Rome. They actually call it Rome, but the colored areas are the areas dominated by Muslims, and the Turks are all in the east. Okay, the only non-Turkish peoples left are in Arabia, in Egypt, and the Berbers in North Africa and Spain. Okay, but the Seljuk Turks really disrupt this Muslim world. Okay, in 1095 to 1300, they are overrun. They are not overrun, but they are invaded by the Crusades. With the appeal of the Byzantines to the west, we have the preaching of the First Crusade by Pope Urban II in 1095. And this happens in the lands of France. And the reason that Urban preaches the crusade in France is because the yellow part here is the Ottonian Empire. Remember, we talked about the Ottonians and the German Empire. And so the German Empire is very unified, and the king is very strong and powerful. But in France, France is broken up into a lot of little individual counties. France rather fell apart because of the Viking invasions. And so France is not unified, which is exactly why Urban II went to France to preach the First Crusade, because there was no king to stop him from assembling an army to go and conquer Jerusalem, which is what he intended to do. And here on the left, you see the preaching of the First Crusade. On the right is the preaching of the Second Crusade. And so we have waves of crusaders, successive wave after wave after wave of crusaders going to the Holy Land, wanting to reconquer Jerusalem. Only the First Crusade was successful. Because the Arab world, or the Muslim world, was so shattered by the Seljuk Turks, the First Crusade was able to conquer the Holy Land. And here we see a crusader setting off on crusade to conquer. And here we see departure of other crusaders in their ships to sail across the Mediterranean to the Holy Land. And here are the routes that the Crusaders took. They weren't unified, they weren't organized, they didn't do it very well, but they did conquer the Holy Land. Here are all the different waves that went at different times, some of them going across the sea and some of them going by land and through Asia Minor. The First Crusade conquered a ring of states in the Holy Land. You can see Edessa in yellow in the north, Antioch, Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem in pink. It's an illusion that the Crusades were a success. They were a great failure. The only one that succeeded was the First Crusade. They conquered the Holy Land, and then everyone went home. And so there was practically nobody left to hold on to it. And so those Crusader states, they only lasted 100 years. The Muslims threw them out very quickly, within one generation, under the leadership of Nur ad-Din and Saladin. The Muslims rallied, and they threw the Crusaders out in only 100 years. So the Crusades were a great failure. And although more and more Crusades came again and again trying to reconquer the Holy Land, they failed and they were thrown out. But in that 100 years they were there, they built typical medieval castles all over the Holy Land. And here you see the most famous Croix de Chevaliers. And this is the most famous of the Crusader castles. The best Crusader castles, the best castles in the world are today in the Holy Land. If you want to go see castles, go to Lebanon, Syria, Turkey, and you see these Crusader castles that are remnants of the Crusader settlement, but they only lasted 100 years. Two of the great heroes of the Crusade were Richard Lionheart, and here is a real portrait of him on his coin, and Saladin, who were the two great champions who fought each other. Here is Saladin. This isn't a real picture, it's just an imagined picture of what Saladin looked like. And they fought each other to a standstill. It was Saladin who really threw the Crusaders out and never to return. They were completely limited. Here are some Turkish arms from the Crusade that you can see are quite different from the European arms. And here are the routes of the Crusaders to the Holy Land after all of the Crusaders were thrown out. If you look along the shore of the Holy Land, that orange region there, they have just a toehold on the Holy Land after Saladin. And so the Crusader states are gone. They just have a little toehold along the coast. And within another 100 years, they were thrown out of that as well. So the Crusades were a great failure, and it makes you wonder why in the modern world there's such an outcry against the so-called Crusaders from the West. I mean, the Crusades traumatized the Muslim world in a way that's totally out of proportion to their success, because they were a failure. But what it did was to mobilize the Muslim world into a new concept of jihad. And this is when the concept of holy war gets very, very strong in the Muslim world, okay, as a result of the Crusades. And here are some more Crusaders. This is a naval battle. Interestingly, the technology of war grew enormously at this time. Both sides developed new war technologies of siege machines of various kinds. Here's a battle going on. Here are more Crusaders going, and the word crusade comes from taking the cross. And here is a Crusader coming, the Crusaders coming on foot, carrying a cross. Here, there's an exchange of culture and castles and feudal courtesy. And one of the interesting things, I showed you Saladin and Richard Lionheart, and they're both chivalrous, courteous warriors who share a very common culture of showing deference to each other and respecting their honor and fighting according to the rules of courtesy and chivalry. And so we see that in that there's an exchange of cultures. The Muslims become more like the Christians, and the Christians become more like the Muslims. And we're seeing this over and over again as we see cultural exchanges going on. Here's the siege of a Muslim castle by the Crusaders. The Crusaders are thrown out of the Holy Land, and so they settle in the islands of the Mediterranean. And here is the Crusader kingdom of Rhodes that was actually run by the Hospitallers. The military orders were a result of the Crusades. The Knights Templar and the Knights I pronounced that wrong. The Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitallers were two of the important military orders. They're kind of like monks on horseback who fought in a celibate way. They took the vows of monkhood while they were fighting battles. There was a setback in the east in 1204 with the conquest of Constantinople. The Crusaders it turned against the Christians. I mean, when they couldn't win the Holy Land, they conquered Constantinople and they held the Latin states in the east for a time. But by 1295, the Crusaders were completely driven out of the Holy Land. And so the Crusades were a massive failure. Although this kingdom of Rhodes lasted until the 18th century, but it's not in the Holy Land. It's an island in the Mediterranean. Okay. Meanwhile, in Spain, the Reconquista was progressing forward, and that was a huge success. The Christians were able to drive the Muslims out of Spain. Here's some Muslim art, and here's the Muslim Spain. I'm going to show you a series of maps. The Reconquista began in about 1000. You see knights, well, there were some remnants, the kingdoms of Castile and Leon in the north of Spain. Were never conquered by the Muslims, and so the Christians had a foothold in the north of Spain. French knights poured into the north as the Crusades began. When the Crusades were going on in the Holy Land, there was a great fervor in Europe to drive the Muslims out of Spain, and so a lot of Crusaders went into the north of Spain, and we're going to see in a series of maps that slowly the Muslims were pushed out of Spain. So here is Spain in 1030 with the formulation of the kingdoms of Castile and Leon and Aragon in the north of Spain. And here we move 100 years later in 1210. You can see that the Muslims, who are the orange here, are being pushed farther and farther south with more Christian kingdoms forming in the north. And here in 1360, you see the pushing, and all those dots there are actually military orders, the Knights Templar, their bases there, and they become very active in Spain. And the formation of Castile and Aragon and Portugal, as the Muslims are pushed farther and farther south. They only have a toehold there in Grenada. And by we'll see in a moment, by 1492, they're completely pushed out. Meanwhile, there are more invasions of the Muslim Empire from the east, and this huge invasion is of the Mongols, yet another tribe of nomads from Central Asia, and the Mongols just explode with lightning speed. The pink area is their first conquest, the conquest of Genghis Khan, stretching all the way from China all the way into Europe, and then the orange part are the successors of Genghis Khan, who conquer even farther into Europe and into southern China and all the way into the Muslim lands in Arabia and in Asia Minor and Turkey. The yellow part is Timur's conquest of India, and so we'll do a whole lecture on the Mongols, but what this did was to shatter the Islamic world. The conquest of the Mongols absolutely shattered the Muslim unity, and I believe that this is the point where Islam lost its tolerance and its eclecticism and its ability to have this rich and inclusive civilization. It turned in upon itself and became very limited at this point. I think the terror of the Mongols, who conquered Baghdad and Russia and all of those regions that used to be dominated by Islam. It was yet another wave of invaders from Central Asia. Well, here are some Mongols. We'll look at some Mongols and we'll see them later. Again, nomads who sweep into the Islamic world. In the West, the Mongols were converted to Islam, and the Muslims conquered India at this time, and we have a new cultural synthesis blending together Mongols and Islam and Indian culture. From India, Islam spread to Indonesia and Malaysia around 1400, and you can see India included into this empire and of the Islamic world. And the red circled region is Malaysia and Indonesia, which remains Muslim to this day. And so that the Muslim world spread all that way into Asia. Part of the Philippines, I should have included a little bit to the north, the part of the Philippines were also Muslim. And here's the great mosque at Delhi, again, Muslim architecture in Delhi in India, a classical Islamic piece of architecture, but now we have those onion-shaped domes that are more characteristic of Mongol culture, and now we see them in India. We see similar architecture in Russia, where the Mongols captured. And this is, again, some Indian architecture very creatively expanding the elements of Islamic culture and incorporating them with Indian culture. And, of course, the Taj Mahal is a result of this great conquest in Agra in India. The Taj Mahal is a mosque. Okay. And it has one of those sort of onion domes on the top of it. More nomads then swept in from Central Asia, and these are the Ottoman Turks. They were nomads from the plains of Central Asia, sweeping in. The Mongol Empire fell apart very quickly in one generation after on the death of the last of the Mongol rulers, and survived only in China, which we'll see later. And so then they were displaced by another wave of Turks. These are the Ottoman Turks, and they swept in and convert to Islam. They swept into the Holy Land and converted to Islam. The white region on this map is the new Ottoman Empire that was conquered at this time. Constantinople fell in 1453 to the Ottoman Turks, and that was the end of the Byzantine Empire. The Turks reached all the way into Europe. If you look at that map, you can see this is the origin of the Muslims in Macedonia and in Bosnia. This is the time when the Turks settled in those regions and brought with them Islam. And so here you can see the fall of Constantinople in 1453 and the Ottoman Empire, which is right here. The Ottoman Turks went all the way to Vienna. Meanwhile, another group of Muslims arose in Egypt, Mamluks, who were a slave dynasty that arose and took over the Muslim kingdom of Egypt and spread to Arabia and the Middle East. This was a slave dynasty that originated from the Caucasus, and they were enslaved and converted to Islam, and they took over the Egyptian Fatimid kingdom. Okay, by 1492, the Muslims were expelled from Spain, and here we see the new kingdoms of Spain. The Muslims were driven out of Granada in 1492. And because of the great, and we'll go back to that map, because of the great effort, the crusading effort to drive the Muslims out of Spain, you have this fervent missionary activity and conversion and expansion activity going on in Spain, which transferred to the discovery of the New World and conditioned the Spanish for the conquest of the New World, which can be looked at as a crusade extended as they moved out of Europe. Okay, we have done a quick thumbnail sketch of the Muslim world, bringing it up to the end of our period, where we end in 1500, this course. Next time, we're going to move to the north and look at another great wave of migration. We're going to look at the Vikings and see how they impacted not only the European world, but the Asian world as well. So next week, we'll do the Vikings. See you then.